I'm John Batchelor with Thaddeus McCutter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, and we are on the eve, the morning of Europe, a decision at The Hague about a body of water called the South China Sea and an assertion by China, the very aggressive China, for the 9-dash line that lays claim to all of the South China Sea as ours. China treats the South China Sea, goes the Chinese analogy, as the United States treats the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, ours. This decision will turn on the courts deciding on whether the Philippines' appeal from 2013 has validity. China has claimed rocks, just above the water rocks called Scarborough Shoals, as its own, though those rocks and that part of the ocean long understood as Filipino territory. However, the 9-dash line is the much larger story, and Gordon Chang of the Daily Beast joins us now to explain what it is that the 9-dash line means to China, not just the Scarborough Shoals, which is something it grabbed a couple of years ago, but the 9-dash line for its present aggression in all of Asia. Good evening to you, Gordon.
Good evening, John and Thaddeus.
The 9-dash line, what does it mean to Beijing? Why are they worried about it?
Yeah, on official maps on the South China Sea, there are either 9 or, depending on the map, 10 dashes that define what's called the cow's tongue, which incorporates about 85% of the South China Sea. And it's a dotted line. So essentially, it's unclear as to what Beijing claims, except we know that it claims every feature, every island, every atoll, reef, rock, shoal inside of the cow's tongue. And it appears that China also claims that it has exclusive economic rights to the waters in that 9-dash line, and maybe even territorial sovereign waters. In the 2011 Xinhua news agency, which is official, said that China had 3 million square kilometers of territorial water. And you can't get there unless you include the South China Sea as sovereign Chinese territory.
Thaddeus?
Hey, Gordon, we've seen this coming for quite some time. The world community's had time to deal with it. They haven't. Will they deal with it now? And what's it going to take?
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to deal with it. I mean, of course, the United States and countries in the region are begging with China to respect the decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, or at least the panel that was impaneled by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. But there is no real indication of what we're going to do when China rejects it. And China, over the last couple of years, has said it will not respect the judgment of the panel. So they put us on notice that they are going to repudiate it, even though they have no right to do that under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is being considered in this particular case.
If I can, Gordon, the larger question, too, as you've mentioned before, China has a history of taking the rights and privileges of a treaty and ignoring its obligations under the treaty. What about that specifically doesn't the world community understand?
Well, I think the world understands it. It just can't come to grips with doing something about it. And I think that what we should be trying to do is expel China from all of these treaties. Although the UN Convention has no expulsion provisions, we should be putting pressure on China to get out of it. And we certainly shouldn't be signing up China to any more multilateral conventions or agreements, because as you point out, and as we've talked about, China just gets the benefits of these deals, and it refuses anything that it doesn't like. So this is just not good for the rest of the world.
1898, the United States grabbed Cuba, took Guantanamo, an indefinite lease. We planted our foot on the Cuban island, and we won't leave it. 1903, the United States grabbed a part of South America. At that time, it was understood to be part of Colombia, turned it into the Panama Canal Zone. We built our canal, we kept the money, and we didn't ask anybody's permission. 1926, U.S. Marines landed in Nicaragua to install a toady government for the United States, for Washington. I could go on, but let's skip to the late 20th century. That would be the Cuban interference, the invasion of Cuba by a militia recruited by the CIA, the Bay of Pigs, and then we have the Grenada episodes of the Reagan administration. In other words, this is Xinhua editorial from China. They are accusing the United States of interfering in the Caribbean for more than 100 years. And they're saying that the United States is not welcome to interfere in the South China Sea. As it is abused the Caribbean, it is abusing the South China Sea. What is the response to that, Gordon, in the region? Not just our response here in the United States, but how does the region think of this argument?
I don't think the region really thinks of that argument because they see themselves as sovereign states, and so they're not going to let China put its foot on their throat. But when you think about this issue in a sort of a theoretical context, look, we're talking about times, most of these events were 100 years ago. That's a very different time than it is today. And the United States doesn't take the same position today as it did then. Bay of Pigs, basically this was, interference with a legitimate government, if you can call it that. But many people don't think that the Castro government is legitimate because it was hardline, communist, coercive, and clearly was trying to stifle the will of the Cuban people. And you can say the same thing about Grenada. There I think are really important differences between those examples and what China is doing today. Because this is 2016, John, and it's a very different world.
Thaddeus?
Yes, Gordon, is the reference to the United States history, especially in its dealings with Latin American nations, intended to stir up discontent amongst those sovereign nations against the United States? Is that part of it? Because otherwise, as you're right, it's just an abstract history lesson that's no longer applicable to U.S. policy.
Well, I think it's about the only argument that China has, because it's saying, look, we're a big power, we can do what we want. And clearly, of course they would like to stir up hatred of the United States. They're not our friends, of course. But I think really it's the only argument that they have, which is the historical one. And as I said, you really can't compare a world today with 100 years ago because the standards are so very different. And what we're trying to do today is have a world of peace and stability, which is governed by rules. President Obama, every predecessor of his, talks about a rules-based order for the world. And if we're going to have a peaceful world, that's the only way that's forward for us. So basically China is saying, let's go back to the dark ages. I mean, that argument does not resonate anywhere.
What's the worst-case scenario for Beijing, Gordon?
The worst-case scenario is essentially that they end up in some accident with the United States. They cause a downward spiral in relations. They need our market. The worst-case scenario in general is World War III with nukes, which is not impossible given what the Chinese want to do.
But the Hague decision, let's keep it to that, to what the document will say tomorrow. What's the worst case for China and that document?
The implication will be that China's 9-dash claims do not stand up under the UN Convention. And so therefore, essentially, you're going to see a repudiation of the Chinese position.
Thaddeus?
Gordon, speaking of downward spirals in markets, I believe you had a recent article about how China is no longer standing behind its currency and starting to drive it down. This is insanity, is it not?
Yeah, this is insanity because China is hosting the G20 in Hangzhou in early September, and they're in the spotlight. What they've done in June is the first indications show that China has really been buying dollars in order to drive down its currency, and this brings this whole issue of currency manipulation to the fore. Donald Trump for a very long time was wrong because China was trying to keep its currency at an artificially high value, but they switched that in June, and they did it right on the eve of both conventions and the U.S. presidential campaign. So if China wants to make itself look like a currency criminal, it did an extremely good job of it, and I think that this was absolutely the wrong time for them to do this.
It's late in the Obama administration's second term, Gordon. It is very unlikely, from what I read, that the Obama administration is going to move bluntly if China presses its case against the Filipinos and takes that Scarborough Shoal and starts to militarize it, or the second Thomas Shoal, another alternative you've added. So these are free months for Beijing, right? It can take its time to be aggressive here, knowing that the Obama administration will not answer.
The Obama administration doesn't want to answer, but I'm not so sure that they won't answer. And the reason is it's a big foreign policy establishment in Washington. There are a lot of players. People are starting to realize the stakes in this, and China can push too far. China has been pushing a lot of countries too far recently, and they can push the United States too far, especially if they do those two things you mentioned, which is to seize Second Thomas Shoal and to start reclamation at Scarborough Shoal. This is really very.
Do you think it is probable that Barack Obama will move with warships against China? Probable. It's possible. Thaddeus, I wonder if Thaddeus' sense of proportion here. Thaddeus, is it probable that Barack Obama would move with warships?
No.
I agree with you. Gordon, we are on the eve. We'll get the decision. We will speak of this on Wednesday. Thank you very much. Gordon Chang, Daily Beast. We're going to get this decision sometime in the middle of the night, East Coast time. It's coming in Europe. Everybody's staying up late in Beijing about this. It's morning time. They're worried about it. They're not having happy tea moments. That is McCarter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes.